I wish to say that Jason presented an acute form and a concern about mortality. As an epidemiologist, I find it very useful to see those p-values that are very strong associated with that specific lesion. And so that should make us optimistic that we will find answers as far as causation in that area. Mark, you brought more of an idea of a pressure on the herd and created an idea on some of those unknown processes that we need to understand in some more detail. I keep on trying to challenge myself in studies on sow mortality to not just make it an epidemiologic study, but to understand the biology behind it. And George, you were saying, I think a couple of days ago, it's surprising how few people in the swine industry and in academia are really studying some of these processes, not only of reproductive outcomes, but also of survivability. Just to emphasize a few points. It's not only live long, it's live long and prosper. The first thing you can do is stop breeding your sows and they'll live longer. And the second point I want to make, even for Spock, and maybe I'm just dating myself too much or identifying myself too much as a geek. If you remember, though he said live long and prosper, he sacrificed himself going into the core reactor. And anybody remember the quote? This benefits, that for the benefit of many, the sacrifice of a few or of one. And there's a balance there in deciding on longevity. And I think we've got to understand what those balances are. Unfortunately, the quote I often use is, epidemiologists predict where the carpet is going to wear out in front of the door. So I'm going to warn you and say a couple obvious things before getting into the questions. You may recognize this, the mathematician's answer to the question, is it A or B? The mathematician's answer is yes. And that's an answer that is perfectly accurate, but patently useless. And we can go through some of those and understand some of the challenges in place. The other thing I want to point out is that there are conflicts in the way we analyze mortality and longevity. Mortality and longevity are not antonyms. They're studied in different ways, and we need to emphasize what we're trying to do in our control measures. I've mentioned before to some that I really wonder whether using sow cards are a good measure of future performance. And we can get a p-value, but we can't get a good R-squared on previous litter size in many cases. And so, should we be understanding and looking more closely what's causing small litter size in a sow? Understanding the inflammatory processes and the like. We also struggle with the idea of multifactorial. It's a bad word, and the quote was to me one time, when you say multifactorial, it means you don't know what you're talking about. And we'd like to cement things down to a simple causation. Hopefully, POPs will answer that, but in many cases it won't. We also need to differentiate between prospective and retrospective analysis. Death certificates aren't always that accurate. And that's what we're asking our staff to do on the farms when we create the cause of mortality at the time of death. We don't know the full history and the factors involved getting up to that point. And it's really in prospective studies that we get a better idea of causes of mortality and opportunities for longevity. The other problem in sows is there's denominator manipulation. Culling is a way of changing the population over different parities. And we need to understand the effect of culling on our decisions on mortality as well. We need to understand herd and individual priorities. I'm going to share that we do have real herd pressures on mortality and management pressures. We need to understand where sows put their resources. It's not automatic anymore in domestic animal production to spend all their resources on survival. Actually, if you look back in evolutionary biology, you can identify species that are more likely to protect themselves and throw a lot of progeny out there, whether it be a fish at the bottom of a river, versus those species that will sacrifice, have a lower number of progeny and put more pressure on the dam and sometimes the male as well. Then on top of that, there's analytic models. We haven't done enough on survivability analysis compared to others. Just a bit of autobiography. I spent a lot of the last number of years working in USAID, working on zoonotic diseases, with the outcome of concern being mortality in humans. And what I didn't realize was the amount of investment going on in mortality analysis in human studies, especially on an international basis. And that was done in a very different set of methods than we've often used in swine production. And to explain that in a bit more detail, it was important enough to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation that actually hundreds of millions of dollars went into a research center at University of Washington to identify it. You may have heard of terms such as global burden of disease, disability-adjusted life year, years life lost, health-adjusted life expectancy. And there's some good in the research that they've done and the characterization that they've done, because it's very different to look at mortality rates than look at what you lost, how many years you lost, how much of effect was there on the lifestyle and productivity of that human. And I've shown this, and the curve hasn't changed very much. We've got a significant loss of our population. If we take a look at this productivity area underneath the curve, there's a lot of room above the curve for improvement. As I mentioned, we know some simple, obvious elements. Get thee to a nunnery will show time after time reproduction is the major insult on a sow. That's a well-duh type of comment, but it can drive the way we start understanding our intervention methods as well. Because what do you do to avoid it? Get pregnant. How do you avoid getting culled? How do you gain higher levels of mortality through pregnancy, though you get culled if you're not pregnant? I've used this in the past. If you remember basic biology, you may have learned the 4 F's for functioning as an individual. You got to eat, you got to feed, you got to fight and adapt under difficult circumstances, often called coping, along with flight, avoiding those circumstances, including infectious diseases. And if you get the joke, the 4th F is reproduction. you got to reproduce yourself. And if you take that in there and you take a look at some of the changes in domestic animal production, we really have to ask whether reproduction is reprioritizing the functions in many of our animals. And do they lactate if they aren't eating? I grew up at a time when we had good, tough sows on the family farm that would dry up if they stopped eating. They wouldn't come back into heat either. And the miracle of the English breeds coming in was in part they continued to reproduce and continued to reprioritize their assets away from themselves to continuing in reproduction. The other question is mortality a good dependent variable in statistical terms? The problem is every mortality is considered equivalent. Is there a difference between a newly entered gilt versus a seventh parity sow in mortality? We're not weighting that part, and as I mentioned, that's where disability-adjusted life years often come into place. And it really doesn't consider the prior state of some of these sows that die. And so if we take a look at why a sow didn't die, if we take a look at longevity, or why it did die, the first reason was it wasn't culled. How much of our culling is actually protective for mortality? We can show you herds where as the breeding target is not met, those groups have higher mortality, which suggests that there's a manipulation of that denominator to protect animals. Because it farrowed. A lot of our mortality is in parent crates. You can say because it didn't cope with the challenges in front, whether it be inflammation or otherwise. Another term can be used, it took life risks. Coming back to, did it get bred? Did it do so in the face of other challenges? We can talk about predictable mortality, and we can talk about unpredictable mortality. And differentiate which ones we can manipulate, such as a lame sow in front of us, versus we're not sure which sow is going to have a pelvic organ prolapse. I get in trouble here, but I'm going to say there are successful culls that we should celebrate. It happens, let's say, seventh parity. It hasn't had problem in the past. There's no welfare concerns on that sow. She's at full sale value when you ship her to market. She's shipped after weaning, after that productive lifespan, and on top of that, there's a gilt ready to take her place. What proportion of the herd actually meets that criteria of culls to celebrate? And if we're talking about longevity, we should actually be characterizing those sows in more detail to understand what makes a successful sow in our sow herd. And we're starting to get some characterizations of that. The other challenge is in terms of how we view mortality, is that there's real problems in moving averages. We should actually look at what we call target motad. When do we get in trouble on mortality? What situations at a herd level, and we're using breeding group as a unit, understand which breeding groups give us the most trouble in getting high mortality rates. High versus low comparisons are a lot more accurate, taking some of the extremes and understanding which are the good sows than simply moving an average. So let me just take this disability-adjusted life year as an example. And instead of life year, we're going to talk about life parity. And we're going to combine mortality and culling. We're going to say that culling represents disabilities. In other words, you're culling a sow because it's not going to be as productive as other sows, and it's going to be less productive than its replacement. We rarely see good determination of disabilities in our farms. In other words, why was the sow culled? And on top of that, we rarely test whether those reasons are correct. It's one of those self-rewarding activities that you can pat yourself on the back. I got rid of that problem. But how do you know it was a problem? And we've got to do some more evaluation on that part. Disabilities are actually economic outcomes on the human side, and culling is actually a challenge not only at the pigs per sow per year side, but even more so on the space utilization side. That culling is a decision on utilization of a pig space, and it really is embedded in opportunity costs. Out of the research, Bill and Melinda Gates funded research center, we get into very detailed outcomes on estimating what are the major pressures on survivability under different conditions. And in many cases, that data has been developed from prospective studies of health records of people. It's been based on the idea of managing and creating productive, healthy lifespans, and it's been used to measure cost effectiveness of interventions. One of the big questions is, what is the cost of mortality? And we know it in general terms, but we need to do better. I'm going to end with this illustration. If we go retrospectively in our records, we can see that we've lost lifetime parities in terms of litter size, in terms of infertility, and in terms of lameness. And that's a combination of culling reasons and mortality reasons. The part that worries me is if we go prospectively and follow through what's happened in the sow, a lot of the litter size and infertility is actually embedded inside lameness. And I would argue in more detail, it's embedded inside inflammatory processes. And understanding that and analyzing prospectively and understanding where we lose the most litters is something we're going to be working on for the next while. But the predominance of the information that we're seeing time after time is there's a real biologic drive in having sows that function correctly, especially in the farrowing crate, especially getting up and eating, getting down, laying down and lactating, and doing that on a regular basis. And lameness, by definition, is an inhibition to do that.